So great, thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce my lovely colleague Simon Smart. Simon works at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and leads the land use group there. He's privileged to have spent the last 20 years working with a wide range of people to try and understand the causes and consequences of vegetation change and to build models of what might happen in the future. He's mainly to be found in the outdoors, and I can vouch for that. So if you have any questions for Simon, please add them to the questions and answers box when Simon is talking, and he'll answer them at the end of his talk. Okay, Simon, so over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jodie. So hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk this evening about how the plant records that BSBI members have compiled over many years have helped us to model how plant biodiversity might respond to positive and negative pressures at work in the environment over about the next 20 years or so. So I really needn't dwell too much on what's already known about environmental change. For example, we know weather extremes in particular have become more frequent, and this increase in frequency has been attributed to human activity in many cases, while in parallel our exploitation of the environment has resulted in declines in some of our rarest species, whose specialized niche space tends to have been reduced by things like land use change and intensive agriculture. The problem is that when we see this kind of trend depicted in the UK biodiversity indicator on the right, it's immediately in the past, it's already happened. So if we want to look to the future and try and explore what might happen if we do things likely to either make the situation better or worse, then we need to be quite creative. And one approach to this is to build some forecasting tools, hence a crystal ball. So if these tools work, then really they should be able to answer questions like these. The last question is particularly interesting, I think, because it addresses the functional role of plants, not just as sources of wonder and interest to us as botanists, but picks up on a number of other roles, such as genetic material for past and future crops, provision of nectar and food for animals and invertebrates, forage grasses for agriculture, injurious weeds that are a disservice to agriculture, nitrogen fixers, and indicators of the quality of our habitats. So I think I would argue that most of these functionally important species really exclude the very rarest plants, which is actually a bit of a relief because they're the hardest to model because of sparse data. And in that respect, it's probably mentioning the BSBI Threatened Plants Project being a real superb exception that's given us so much good data on the occurrence of those rare species. But really the fact that the common, or at least not the rarest plants, contribute so much to ecosystem functioning is not really surprising, since plants that are frequent or contribute high cover and biomass are logically likely to be most important in driving ecosystem functioning. For example, it's been estimated that just 22 common plant species contribute around 90% of the nectar production in British ecosystems. And if we look at some of the top nectar producers in the list on the right here, you can see that they are indeed some of the most frequent species at the hectare level across Britain. I should just say this is data from Plantat, so it's Atlas 2000, and it'll be really interesting to see how some of the common species have changed, or perhaps not, in terms of their frequency in the 2020 Atlas alongside the rarer species. Well, in fact, our forecasting is made a good deal easier and more relevant because we have solid information about which plants support which functions or services. And we can use the kind of database that I've shown an extract from here to make predictions about how individual species will change as the environment changes. And we can summarize these by these, if you like, plant service groups. So for any particular location or quadrat sample, we can calculate a functional group richness that you can see there in the bottom row. And that can be either based on the observed species present, or it can be calculated from our forecasting models. So I've mentioned these forecasting tools. So how do we actually do this forecasting? Well, let me put my overalls on and show you around the engine room of Multimove. This is an R package that we've been developing over the past probably 10, 12 years now. It comprises 5 different statistical techniques that are used to quantify the niche of around 1,300 species along 7 dimensions. And these relate to soil conditions, pH, carbon, nitrogen, soil moisture, but also to climate and vegetation height. And the surface plot here shows a slice through the niche model for Drosera rotundifolia in 2 dimensions relating to substrate pH and substrate wetness. The black dots represent occupied plots in the large massive training data used to build the models, and the colors indicate whether the model predicts low, so blue, or high, so red, suitability of conditions for the species. So what we want really from our model is for the redder colors to coincide with the black dots. And I'll come back towards the end of the talk on how we've tested these models in other ways. So having built the models, we can use them in predictive mode by adjusting values of the 7 dimensions or axes and see how that impacts the favorability of conditions for our species of interest. So the values on the 7 axes are the inputs used to solve each model, and this generates a new predicted habitat suitability value. So that could be more blue or more red, depending on the fit between species and the changing or the changed environment. And a key issue really is in deriving an appropriate scenario, which means determining how a particular change in the environment, such as a management intervention or extreme weather, will drive expected change along the soil, climate, or vegetation height axes. So a scenario is in a way sort of deciding on the kind of levels of change we want to apply to these niche models. And they can come from expert knowledge, experiments, or indeed other dynamic models, other process models. So I'm going to show you an example of how we've applied these models to explore what might happen if extreme weather and flooding became more frequent. So Storm Desmond, those of you who live up in Cumbria up in the northwest will undoubtedly remember this. It happened back in December 2015 and severely impacted Cumbria. It broke the UK record for the amount of rain falling in a single 24-hour period and resulted in huge damage to infrastructure, landslips, and also major flooding of property and agricultural land. And you can see an example of that here. And in fact, this is the area I'm going to focus on. This is one of the areas that was severely impacted. It's the lovely Lythe Valley, just a few miles from where I live in Kendal. The valley is prime pasture land to the west, so the sort of more distant part of the view becomes peatier to the east, so nearer to the screen, nearer to the viewer. And that's where the National Trust have instated a new wetland complex. And incidentally, the image on the left actually shows the impact of soil and floodwaters on lolly and perennie cover after 4 weeks of submergence. The orange and brown on the right is where the farmer has sprayed off the dying grass, so in many cases lowly and perennie, and ploughed and will reseed, all of which costs money, of course. So what we wanted to do was forecast what might happen to the vegetation if flooding continued to occur more frequently in the valley. So we wanted to say something about how the species composition might change over time if this frequent flooding led to greater soil moisture, greater levels of wetness occurring through longer periods in the year, across more years. And we can really break this down into some science questions, such as will flooding plus gradual climate change result in vacant niche space? Or will any new potential colonists deliver a different suite of ecosystem services and functions than the existing vegetation? But really, for those who work in the valley, the questions are much simpler and more practical. The farmers we spoke to simply wanted to know if they would be able to farm in the same way in the future, or in fact farm at all. Whereas the National Trust wanted to know whether the wetland potentially could expand, and would conditions become steadily more favourable for wetland plants, even potentially for sphagnum species. So BSBI records have proved absolutely vital in this modelling process. The key thing they do really is impart local realism, because they provide for us a species pool for the 10 kilometre square here in which the Lythe Valley is located. What I mean by that is if conditions change so that the species present in the flooded areas gradually decline, then which species might replace them? So using the BSBI database to define this local pool constrains our modelling and means that our forecast of the plants that might make up these new assemblages is at least based on species known to occur in the local area, even though assisted dispersal, green hay, things like that, other management measures might be necessary to get them onto the site and established. So the way the modelling really worked was that we sampled the vegetation and soil in areas across the valley after flooding had receded and during the growing season. The soil data plus vegetation height plus local climate defines the inputs needed to model the baseline. Then the actual species we model comprise the list of species observed surviving in each sample plot, plus those extras recorded by the BSBI in the wider 10-kilometre square, thus providing the raw material for potentially building new plant communities better suited to these new conditions. So these new conditions represent our scenario of environmental change. In this example, this involved adjusting the climate variables given projections for the 5 by 5 kilometre squares in which we sampled, increasing soil moisture to represent more frequent flooding, and with or without an increase in vegetation height to represent potentially a rewilding scenario of no grazing or holding vegetation height constant to represent continued grazing. And incidentally, it's easy to say the word rewilding, but for the farmers in the valley, it's a very fearful term and raises the spectre of the end of several hundred years of actually living and working in the valley. So these are the results in a nutshell for the Lythe Valley locations. Each axis on the radar plot relates to change in habitat suitability or forecast change in habitat suitability for a particular group of functionally important plants. The red line is the modelled baseline. The orange and blue lines represent our attempt at forecasting the impact of flooding, so raised soil moisture or flooding plus or minus expected climate change. And you can see that most groups of plants, perhaps not surprisingly, are expected to see a decline in habitat suitability. But interestingly, climate change is expected or predicted to buffer this extra wetting effect. The only positive impact is on high habitat quality indicators, which is interesting. They either remain at constant habitat suitability or undergo an increase. With additional wetting, though, marked species compositional turnover is expected. So what we predict we'll see is a move from high quality grassland indicators, so mesotrophic grassland indicators, toward a replacement by more wet grassland species and wetland indicators. And I think I should say again that the role of the BSBI data records is absolutely critical here in defining this extra pool from which new species can be drawn as conditions change and different species are favoured. So this is another example by my PhD student, Bede West. He's been using BSBI data to define species pools again at the 10K square level, but this time across Wales, in order to help model the possible impacts of agri-environment scheme interventions. And because the outputs of the model scale between 0 and 1, we can assign these model communities to the National Vegetation Classification. And this is an example of the model response to no fertiliser inputs in Welsh neutral grasslands over 15 years, modelling locations that we sampled as part of the Glastier Monitoring Environmental Evaluation Programme. So here we predict a change in favourability of conditions that's moving away from improved grassland at the baseline, the black bars, and moving away from improved grass and NVC units as the best fits for a large number of baseline quadrats, and increasingly towards unimproved and semi-improved grass and units as the best fits to grouped NVC communities. And the key modelled result here was that 5 years was really not enough to see significant change. It really took 15 years to drive this kind of shift. And also over this short period up to 2029, climate change, as depicted in the UKCP kind of movement in climate, wasn't expected to be a major driver. So in this instance, we weren't factoring in any prediction of extreme weather. This was more the kind of average climate change predicted by the UKCP ensembles. So I've talked about these crystal balls and how we've used them, and I love doing this work. It sort of kept me doing interesting things for many years. But it kind of looks lovely, but you might say, well, are your models any good? And that's a perfectly valid question. So here's some examples of model testing. This is firstly some recent work by Amy Jenkin at the University of Cumbria. who worked with me, or I supervised a project that she undertook. And she showed how Multimove was able to successfully discriminate between favourable sites for marsh fritillary butterfly in the Lake District via modelling the niche of its food plant Succiser pratensis. So you can see in the left-hand graph the significantly higher predicted habitat suitability values for the Bassenthwaite site, where the largest and healthiest populations of both food plant and butterfly are present. And this is a strong test of the model, because we're predicting a resolution of 2 by 2 meter quadrat samples. So the model basically has nowhere to run. It's either right or wrong, and you can test that because you can stand in those 2 by 2 meter quadrats and say, well, is Succiser here or not? Is the marsh fritillary known from the area or not? But also remember that all we're really giving the model is 3 soil variables: vegetation height and local climate. So this is, I mean, for me, it kind of indicates our kind of modeling approach here. And this is one of the examples that we've used to sort of support the credibility of the models, if you like, in this kind of work. A second test is shown here. This is basically using a statistic that tests the balance between a correct prediction, so the model says a species is present and it really is present, versus an incorrect prediction, which is obviously the species we predict it to be present, but it's in fact absent. And the testing process involves building all the models over and over again, and each time leaving out a quadrat in the model building data and predicting the species that are present in the emitted quadrat, and doing that over and over again many thousands of times. So, I mean, what I'd say about this is, in a sense, it's not quite as strong a test as a test on a completely independent data set like the previous example, but performance is extremely good nonetheless, shown by the distribution of the statistics here. BSBI Research Committee also helped fund a small project to get 2 national experts to evaluate the model niche of each species to see whether it agreed with their experience of the British flora. So this is a slightly different approach to model testing, where we're not undertaking a kind of quantitative test, where we're basically using experts and their perfectly valid approach to say, well, is your depiction of the niche, does that resonate with what I know about the species and its habitat preferences across Britain? The results were quite mixed, yet very interesting. And so please download this free paper for more information, if you like. A major conclusion was that we needed more experts to assess more complicated or more complex representations of each niche. And so to this end, we devised a website to allow anyone to look up their favorite species, examine the modeled niche, and you can vote whether you think the model is good or bad, or you can say it's very poor. It's absolutely fine. You can vote, and that information is actually incredibly useful. So I would really encourage you all to try this out, and your scores, the scorings that we accumulate, will be hugely appreciated and could support further efforts to put BSBI data to good use in building these kind of crystal balls to help us manage our way through the climate and the biodiversity crisis. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll stop and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was fabulous. A really interesting talk. I think, Louise, have you got some questions there for Simon?
Yes, there are several questions in. The first one is in from Terry Swainbank, who asks, what about the changes in herbivore abundance and pollinator changes? Are these taken into account directly or by a surrogate?
So the models are focused on plants. So if I understood the question correctly, we therefore there's no sense in which the models are modeling animals, if you like. Maybe I've misunderstood the question, but what we do is contribute to other work that is modeling potentially changes in animals and pollinator invertebrates, and explore the extent to which changes in plant species that support those animals is consistent with declines in those or increases in those animals. So it's contributing to the evidence base, but as regards changes in plant species, rather than modeling the animals directly.
Okay, thanks.
Cool.
Jodie, do you have a question?
I do. So Simon, it seems there's no dynamism in your model, i.e. no competition or dispersal, and how will you address that?
Yeah, doing that's really difficult because, and there's a trade-off at work here. So we want to model many, many different plant species as accurately as possible. And ordinarily, you know, that in order to model competitive processes at the local patch level and model dispersal, you need good data for lots and lots of species, and that's really hard to come by. It's costly to do. And so, and you can do it using plant traits. People have done that. But as soon as you start to use plant traits, you're again up against kind of data gaps and subsuming the sort of individualistic behavior of particular species under the banner of a particular trait variable. So you're immediately generalizing slightly. But it's something that we are progressing. We've decided that competition is kind of not a priority. And we partly do that by, if you like, selling the outputs of the model as habitat suitability rather than actual predicted occurrence. So suitability of conditions, if the species gets there with a kind of fair wind and the right management, it could establish and persist. Of course, the kind of ghost of competition is present within the actual training data that we use to build the model, which, you know, is a static depiction of competition that led to the way it kind of occurs in presence absence in the training data. So that's not quite the same again as dynamism. But we're really prioritizing things like, we are prioritizing dispersal, but also adaptive capacity, the extent to which variability in species traits can mean that it might not disappear so quickly from places under environmental change, because it can bend in the wind a bit because of its sort of phenotypic or genotypic plasticity. So that's the kind of things that we're really aiming at. A bit long-winded there and a bit evasive to your question, but yeah,
excellent.
it's a good question.
So it's always really fascinating to listen to you. I'm like, I barely understand it at all, but I love it. It's excellent. Thank you, Simon. That's really cool. Louise, do you have another question?
Yeah, there's another one in. Michael Scott says, great talk, modelling, thank you. And then he asks you for a link, Simon, if that's possible. He says, is the interesting marsh fritillary habitat preference modelling paper published somewhere and available to view?
No, it's not, unfortunately. And just this week, I was trying to twist the arm of Amy to schedule writing a paper, but it was an undergrad project. She's now employed by CH in a different group, and I have limited influence on her her immediate working life at the minute. So it would be great to get a paper out, and we kind of have plans to do that, but yeah, it's not published and it's not going to come out anytime soon, I have to say, but it'd be great to get it out at some point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, let me know who we need to talk to at work, Simon, to get that to happen. I can help you.
Yeah, excellent. Good idea.
Yep. And another question from Sarah Cousins. What about plots where you model a plant not to occur, but it does occur?
Well, you model plants and you say it doesn't occur.
Yeah, you say it doesn't occur, and it does occur in that area. I think that's right, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah from Sweden, I guess. That's a tricky question. Yes, so I guess there's two sides to this. There's the influence of that on model building, and there's the influence of that on model prediction, and they're, you know, of course they're kind of linked anyway. So what we don't have in the model is detection. We don't have the detection process, and so you have to interpret the kind of species in light of that failing, if you like. But I suppose the model testing we've done up to now means that we have a reasonable amount of faith in the models to get things roughly right on average. Faith being the operative word, but it's kind of, you know, it's more belief based on increasing evidence that the models perform reasonably well. But yeah, it's a fair point. We don't do anything quantitative to cope with that issue, and it would be really, really nice to model the detection process in these kind of data, but that is difficult to do. I was talking to Ollie Pes. Well, me and Ollie Pes got a bit of a very brief exchange about this recently, because I think he's sort of exercised by this generally, and as regards sort of analysing data sets that he deals with. One of the things that we did think about very briefly, or I thought about, was, I think Ollie's thought about it as well, is using the data from the FISC studies, where you've got kind of many people repeatedly trying to find the same species, and they may miss species where other people are detecting them, whether potentially that's a source of detection data that we could into another round of these models. But it's a fair point, Sarah, and we don't have that built into the model.
Sarah also says, great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
So that's all good. So I think we've got time, maybe, Louise, for one more question, then we need to move on. But
we have, and there are 4 questions in this. So Simon, maybe you could answer them after we finish.
Sure.
But can I just give one to you, because I'd really like to know the answer to this. Raphael Karlenberg, who's actually got a paper over on the exhibits page, if people want to go and look at that, says, fascinating. Can you run the model backwards, in inverted commas, by feeding it with recorded climate data and comparing habitat predictions with recorded field observations?
So you mean running it retrospectively and trying to reproduce? Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'm just thinking that through. So yeah, perhaps we could link up and discuss that later on.
And then, great, thank you, Simon. Back to you, Jodie.
Great. No, thank you very much, Simon. It was an awesome talk.